had enough of this drivel!
Ready when you are.
Einstein and go-go. Einstein and go-go. Einstein and go-go.
Bagpipes, wedding bells, Kef McCulloch. Gonna be some sweet sounds coming down on this 30-second I'll Explain Later, the Doctor Who podcast that has the Loihar Guile, and thus nothing can stop us now. With your hosts, John West,
Jim Hall,
and Matt Needer. Tonight, 50 years before Jodie Whittaker was cast, Patrick Troughton struck a blow by starring as the first female Doctor, as well as the first Doctor to attempt a wildly unconvincing accent in Bonnie 60s historical The Highlanders.
Things go catastrophically wrong when Rose travels back in time to meet her long-dead dad. He's a balding Bruce Willis knockoff with a terrible taste in shirts who wants to keep yoghurt on the window ledge. No wonder Christopher Eccleston's furious in 2005's Father's Day.
and Bonnie Langford has a terrifying encounter with some exploding balls as the 7th Doctor's era is launched in an adventure drawing on the combined brainpower of history's greatest geniuses. And Pip and Jane Baker, leave the girl, it's Time and the Rani we want.
Hey, welcome to March, where certainly in the UK, it's still winter, kind of, isn't it? It's
Oh yeah,
bloody freezing.
brass monkeys out there.
Danger of snow and all sorts. But we start off tonight by going back to December 1966, edging over into the new year of 1967 for the Highlanders.
John's
and
nodding in
before
agreement.
we go any further, I'd just like to consult John in Dictionary Corner.
Yeah, that's all fine, Jim.
Good. We can carry on. For the Highlanders, Patrick Troughton's second adventure. So the setup here is the second Doctor, Ben and Polly, land in 1746 and get caught up in the aftermath of the Battle of Culloden, falling in with some Scots rebels.
Oh, is this set in Scotland?
Which leads to an adventure where Ben and his new friend Jamie McCrimmon try and avoid becoming slaves in colonial territories. And Polly and her new friend Kirsty blackmail a British officer, and the Doctor tries on a lot of weird hats and bizarre disguises. A few notable things to say about this. Let's say Troughton's second adventure. It's the first to feature Jamie McCrimmon, although I think as we'll probably agree, is not at all like the character we come to know. He wasn't really intended to be a companion at this point.
It's sort of weird that he became a regular off the back of this. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think Jamie's probably the best thing about the second Doctor's whole run. But off the back of this...
We've got Victoria, let's not forget.
But it's strange that off the back of this, he becomes a companion.
I get the feeling Innes Lloyd recognised that Fraser Hines was a good
actor
chap
on their hands.
Yeah. Also, this story is entirely missing. I'm guessing you guys did the Audible version?
Absolutely, with added narration from Fraser Hines.
Oh, good. Not Peter Purvis this time.
No.
Okay. I say entirely missing. The bits that do survive, ironically, are the stuff that was cut out by the censor, I think in Australia. So if you are watching the loose cannon reconstruction of this, as I did, it's quite nice that it goes from a bunch of telesnaps and then springs into life just as people are about to get lynched or get run through with a sword.
The most
or
violent
something.
moment.
And finally, it's well known that this is the last of the classic series pure historicals, in that it's just the characters trapped in history rather than an aliens there at the same time, until 1982 when it made a triumphant return in Black Orchid.
Woo.
So, bearing all that in mind, Matt...
Can I just add a little addendum, to those
on.
points of interest that you raised? That I didn't realise until I was reading around on this morning that this was also the first story to get wiped. And
yes,
it was wiped,
only a few months after.
Only wiped 2 months after it went out, which meant that it had a tiny window on the shelf when it was in existence. So, this could well be considered the rarest of rare Doctor Who.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what the reason for that was.
Well, let's see.
Let's see. Well, let's get on to that.
Hour, we'll get down to cases on that front.
Matt, had you had an appointment with the Piper previously? Or was this your first time?
No. No, this is the first time I came to this, and it's sort of weird. It's in that kind of early Troughton era stuff where, I mean, I don't know, perhaps you can tell me whether or not this was a script that was left over from the Hartnell era, whether they had a view that Hartnell might well have been doing this story.
I don't think so. What I understand reading around is Elwyn Jones, who wrote it, was kind of commissioned to write it, possibly getting as far as a treatment, but he was a very busy writer. And when it came to it, he couldn't do any of the script at all. So I think it's his outline, and Jerry Davis, the script editor, wrote the whole thing. So it's possible the vague idea was going to be a Hartnell, but it was always the script itself. I think you can tell from something I'm sure we discussed, the Doctor's a very different character
what they give
in
him
this.
to do.
He's a master of disguise.
Yeah.
Yes, he's a
I wonder who's next
pre-Clouseau.
behind the magic curtain when it comes out. So no, I'd not come across this before. And initially my feelings were that it was possibly a little bit of a piece with the smugglers, partly because I'm listening to it on audio. It is pure. It is purely
Adventure.
historical.
Yeah.
There's no sci-fi element to this at all. And I found the opening sort of 10-15 minutes of it or so a bit of a slog, to be honest. Just I don't know. I find some of the historicals, particularly at this point where they're less inquiring about, the early Hartnell historicals are all about inquiring about the nature of history and speculating on what it would be to be there as part of that. So there's quite a character basis to it. Whereas these later ones are just about, interestingly, about creating a tableau and setting a story within it, as opposed to perhaps when the Doctor sees history later, it tends to be A, a bit more sci-fi, and B, kind of puts him at the centre of events. So, the Doctor starting the Great Fire of London or something like that. Whereas, here it's very much that there is just this ongoing situation, and we see an escapade within it. So it's a long way around saying I found it a bit of a slog to begin with. And then actually, surprisingly, I was quite won over by it. I think it's quite good fun. Mainly,
You don't sound like you mean that. It's quite good fun.
well, it's all kind of relative, really, but there were lots of bits to this that caught my ear and quite engaged me. The first, primarily, is I think all of the regulars are great in it. I think including Fraser Hines as Jamie. I sort of agree that there's possibly not that much on the page for the character. He's a supporting character in this. I think Fraser Hines gives a spirited performance, and the fact that plus he's fairly easy on the eye was probably enough to see him join as a regular.
He's a good-looking lad.
Yeah, he is. They're not writing him very much as like the new companion in waiting as they do with some other stories. But Ben and Polly are terrific. Ben gets some great lines. I like it when he's in the prison and he sees that the water's going to come up, and he says,
it's not my bath night.
"Today's not my birthday." He's great. Polly gets lots of really resourceful things to do, and her and Hannah Gordon as Kirsty form a nice little double act and go around and do things. The Doctor's fantastic in this. And the reason why I was asking whether or not whether this is a Hartnell holdover or not was because this is a very different characterisation from obviously what we've seen previously with the Doctor, but also to what the Troughton Doctor later became. So he's always got something on the go, like he's disguising himself or double crossing people. But he's also a much less reassuring and a slightly more kind of dangerous character. He's incredibly violent, and so the scene I love is the one where he keeps bashing the guy's head against the desk and asking him if he's getting a headache yet, which is really funny. But also he's much less reassuring. So when he talks to Kirsty and Polly about the plan to get on board the Annabelle boat, and they say, "Okay, great, what are we going to do when we get there?" And he just says, "I don't know, we'll probably figure something out anyway. I need some sleep right now." And there's a kind of sharp, slightly dangerous quality to him, which I think gets eroded over time. But I think here is a really good fit for him, and Patrick Troughton's really good. There's some fun stuff going on with all the supporting cast. Like, I love their Kirsty and Polly's continual humiliation of Algernon Finch, and some of the other sort of supporting characters are quite fun.
So he's the British officer that they sort of capture in a animal pit.
Yes.
Rob.
And then
hold
repeatedly
it over
rob and blackmail throughout the rest of the story. So all of that stuff's quite fun, and I think the story I don't think is much to write home about. But I think it sometimes with these sort of later history stories, the absence of any sort of big idea to grasp onto means that, to me, they can be slightly impenetrable, particularly when you can't see the costumes or the direction or see if there was any real sort of flair going on. But for me, the character stuff across the board and the sort of general quite witty dialogue got it over the line for me. So, it's not the best thing I've ever heard, but a cautious thumbs up.
John Boy.
I think that it's important perhaps to see this in the context of this only being, as Jim said, the second story after the shock of a regeneration. And oftentimes we've even seen this with, say, the thrill of Rose being followed by the end of the world, which is a
Yeah.
bit of a different pace. Then after Christmas Invasion, what's the first?
New Earth.
New Earth. Again, it's sort of, it just takes a step back, doesn't it? The one before this is what, Power of the Daleks?
Yes.
Which, I mean, I haven't seen that, but it's Daleks, and I can imagine that was quite an up adventure, and you want to have a strong, like with Twin Dilemma, you want to have a strong intro for your new Doctor. But then they've come here
and make
to
it clear it's not going to be kind of like the preceding.
but then you sort of fall back, so you have a whiz bang like this is the Doctor, whether you like it or not, and then you have a sort of fallback episode where the series can sort of draw breath, and the viewer can draw breath a little. And I think just in terms of what this needs to do, that's kind of where it is. And so they've decided not to do anything that's sort of particularly high stakes, but allows the characters to just sort of be, and for the Doctor in particular to exist and present himself. And
Kind of gives him a sandpit to play in, basically, doesn't
Yeah.
it? And we discover him through that.
Because the
exactly.
plot really is just so they get separated quite early on, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean,
and
there's the slave trade. I don't want to call it business, but it doesn't feel like there's a big ticking clock or anything. That
No,
they're trying
they just
avoid
need to
it,
get back together and get out of there.
Yeah, I agree with Jim. It doesn't feel like... I mean, that could be some pretty live ammunition in terms of high-stakes, emotional and moral and ethical stuff. It's never really played for that. Whereas... And the Doctor, of course, you see, as you've kind of alluded to, he's master of disguise, he dresses up as a woman, does silly voices. We've seen the Hartnell Doctor take on a different identity in order to pass himself off. In the Romans, for example.
In a purely historical story as well, yeah.
And indeed for laughs, because, the famous scene where he plays the harp silently.
Yeah.
So it's not completely dissimilar. But
there's a smile curling on your lips as you remember that.
Well, that's a great... I mean, that is a top draw scene. So it's not like... I think doing some of the reading and research after I'd watched it, people sort of say this is a wildly different characterization. Actually, I think that there's a certain Venn diagram overlap here as to what the Doctor's prepared to do. But it's clearly the case that he's happier to send him, and that's probably true of Patrick Troughton as well versus William Hartnell. He's happier to send himself up and to be a bit more scatty. And I agree that he's always got a scheme on the go, and he comes up with different characters and so on and so forth. He seems quite inventive. As you say, there's a degree of violence, but in the right for the right purpose.
I don't mean that as a negative. I think it's a hoot. He's all action in this.
And so I can see that they're trying, but I guess the problem for me is that they're doing this without really a sense that they have got an idea of where they want to take him. When the third Doctor arrives, right from Spearhead from Space, they know exactly what they want to do with that character. I mean, that actually arrives pretty much exactly fully formed. But, with other Doctors, David Tennant takes a while to warm up through Christmas Invasion. By New Earth, you know what you're doing, but there's a bit of building to do. Similarly with other Doctors. With this, they're trying to do that, but it doesn't really have any relationship with the Doctor we come to get from Patrick Troughton.
No.
And it's kind of a bit all over the place. It doesn't feel like it's pushing in any particular direction. I found this an incredibly tough listen, and that said, I agree with much of what Matt said about the performances being very good, particularly Annika Wills, is it? Annika Wills and Michael Craze, yeah. And Troughton does a great job as well, because he's being funny. But I found this a bit of a slog. For a start, and this perhaps says more about my cognitive abilities than the story itself, I did find just latching on to what the plot was doing and where they were going and why the characters were running. Maybe it's because it just didn't grab me, but it kind of washed over me that they were going from place to place doing this and that, nicking some money and whatever.
Well, in a travelogue sort of narrative as well, you kind of want to see that.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
that is also a major problem on this, because some of the costumes look quite fun from the pictures I've seen.
Snaps,
but,
I've got to see, as with when we did the Smugglers, it's a real shame this is missing, because you look at the telesnaps and you do think, this looks like this would have been a really good...
Whereas it's like we know what Cyberman looks like or something, whereas this is...
And all the stuff like rowing on a boat and going to a bigger ship and that sort of thing. Again, it's one of those where we lost this?
I mean, that looks quite impressive from the telesnaps as well. No, they actually went to a big water tank. Can't remember which of the studios it was, but that looks... It's a fuzzy telesnap, but it looks pretty convincing.
So, I can't I can't, of course, discount that maybe seeing it would just connect all of those dots a lot more, and I don't know whether that would have made a big difference. Who's the director on this again?
Hugh David,
Yeah.
who, trivia that I think a lot of people know, he was briefly in the running to play the Doctor to begin with.
Oh, right.
But he was only about 38 at the time. But yeah, I think when it was Rex Tucker was going to be the producer, he was keen to get him in. He was an ex-actor and came on board, did this, and I think Fury from the Deep.
Well, we shan't, I guess, know
which is also missing.
what to make of his direction of this. But I just found this a very tough listen. It seemed to be quite all over the place and not necessarily, I don't think it landed the knockabout romp feel of, say, the Romans. There are basically
It's almost aiming for in places, oddly. I mean, it's like script's clearly meant to be quite funny, even if it's got less of a kind of farce overtone to it.
I mean, to this point, in the Hartnell era, there are essentially two types of historical, right? There's your Aztecs and your massacres. Which
those are the grim ones.
Well, I don't. They're the Lucarotti ones, right?
Yeah.
Both, are they?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the massacre, I found that quite tough, but that's mostly because it's just too long. But God only knows. It's fascinating the degree, its commitment to really exploring the motivations of the characters, the fanaticism of the age, the whole sort of that Huguenot episode. Yeah. It really wants to delve into that period of history, and the peril comes from placing our characters into that. With the Aztecs, there's a fierce and fascinating exploration of cultural relativism and a kind of treatise on societal evolution. The Romans is a knockabout romp.
Yeah.
And the Romans is a knockabout romp that is just the right side of Carry On and Benny Hill, to the extent that we're not kind of wincing at it now.
Yes.
So it seems to have that genius bit of magic dust that did what it needed to do for Doctor Who to kind of stretch into that territory of familiar old school music hall British comedy without straying into some of the areas that would now perhaps make those like the Carry-Ons and Benny Hill a bit of a tough watch.
Yeah.
This doesn't seem to do either of those things. It's neither an interesting exploration of that period. In fact, it is just a setting.
Yes.
1746, Bonnie Prince Charlie, Jacobite Rebellion. It's literally just a setting.
Assumes quite a lot of knowledge as well on behalf of the listener. I
mean, because it's certainly not something I learnt about in school history. But I'm kind of aware. I have an idea in my head that in the 60s and 50s, people probably had a different history curriculum at school.
Yeah,
certainly, because even things like Marco Polo and things. I imagine these are all big bits of school book history, but they certainly weren't on the curriculum when I was.
Interesting to know.
Things change.
If any of our really old listeners could write in and let us know.
Yes.
Yeah, on a postcard, presumably. It's just a setting, but also again, maybe it's visual, maybe it's seeing the Doctor in a pinny or something, but the funny stuff didn't really feel broad enough to be really funny. There's not a standout comic moment.
I don't think it's as good as Pertwee's a cleaning lady in Green Death. Yeah, he seems to go for these. He's very on side with the domestic help.
For me, it just kind of fell between two stools, really, and as a result, I was going to give it a pass for being that kind of take a breath second episode or second serial where you're developing the character, but it doesn't seem that there's actually been a brief to develop the Doctor in a particular way.
Yeah,
it's just like make sure he's a bit different from Hartnell. And then that hasn't been...
See what sticks.
Yeah, and it's... I don't know, it just seems a bit sloppy.
Jim, what do you make of this?
I've seen this a few times before, and previously I've really quite enjoyed it. I've said I like...
So always via the telesnap?
Yeah, no, I've said it before, but I'm a big fan of the telesnaps. There's just enough visual representation there that you can get a sense, but concentrate on the audio. I don't find it distracting in the way that the animations usually are. But yeah, watching it this time, it kind of left me a bit flat, really. And I do have to say, we always have to remember these things were made to sort of go out once and vanish. And I'm not sure if this is my fault.
This did.
I'm not sure if this is my fault for watching the same thing 3 times within about 5 years or something. Clearly, no one was ever intended to watch it in that kind of detail. So, but yeah, it's just echoing the things you guys have said. It's the couple of interesting things for me with it. I think it's generally viewed as a leftover Hartnell, kind of a remnant of that era. Given, I think John's just done a good job taking it to pieces and how it doesn't really fit with the kind of style of historicals we've seen previously. Do you think they could have gone any further with this? Or, I mean, the take seems to be that Innes Lloyd as producer wasn't keen on them, or possibly Patrick Troughton was not keen on them. But either way, there was a sort of feeling of, can we get more into modern adventure and stuff?
Well, it lacks that kind of hand on the tiller setting a tone for it, really, as John says, that, the previous models. And I mean, I kind of felt the same way. I mean, I wasn't particularly taken with The Smugglers, which is the same season, isn't it? But just earlier.
Yeah,
it's the season opener for this season. Yeah. And both of these just sort of seem to lack that firm, like, right, what are we doing here? And I guess in some ways that's something that dogs the Troughton era as a whole, but that sort of lack of a kind of grasp of what it is can be easier to disguise when you've got space robots and aliens and things like that. I mean, I think generally this era suffers from a lack of a big idea other than let's just plonk the Doctor in these settings. But that is more exposed, I think, by the lack of visual hooks or kind of conceptual hooks that you might otherwise put on it. Yeah, so it's kind of neither one thing nor the other, really. You sort of see why with the later... I mean, I'm sort of have mixed views on a lot of the later, especially new series kind of history episodes that are just taking the bits of history you've heard of and getting a guest actor to dress up like they did in The Painting, and then
or the back of the banknote.
Yeah, exactly, and have the Doctor sort of interact with them and see how sparks fly. I think that is not necessarily a particularly great approach, although sometimes it's made for some good episodes. But here, I mean, it's not an era of history that anyone is particularly going to look at it and go, oh, great, it's like, I'm so excited about what they're doing here. It doesn't do much to get much out of the period, but neither is it. And I mean, I think that's the thing why I really like the Luca Rotti stuff, because that sort of sidesteps it by saying, okay, so the massacre, the Huguenots might not necessarily be the most, I would say, exciting as in...
Box office.
Exactly, box office. It might not be the most box office period of history to step up to. But his stuff is all about just asking what it would be for you to be in that situation. And especially the Aztecs is really asking you, like, if you were to go back in time and experience this moment, what would it feel like? What would it do? And then, obviously the Romans is just an excuse for a good knockabout farce. So there's no overall idea here. And I think the lack of an overall idea that I think was largely the case during this era is more mercilessly exposed by the lack of shiny.
And bearing all that in mind, what you've just said, do you think the historicals had kind of run their course at this point? I mean, like I said, the only other time we had a pure historical was Black Orchid, which we're not going to review now, but it seems like something that... Do you think it had any more life in it, or do you think it had run its course?
It's sort of, I hate to kind of throw my lot in, because it always seemed to me quite a lazy sort of calculation to say that the historicals were boring compared to the space stuff, which is kind of the... this is always the thing that I think is rumbling at the background when they said, well, of course, they had to phase them out, or they weren't going to do that anymore, because, like, the space stuff was, as John said again, box office compared to... I sort of come back to the same point, really. I don't think they had necessarily run their course, because obviously there's an awful lot of history, and I think a good enough writer with an interesting idea could obviously do something, whether it's an exploration of the era or whether it's an exploration of other themes. I think back to what John was saying. I mean, obviously that's a sci-fi one, but thinking back to what John was saying about Tooth and Claw last month and saying that, you're doing X, but it gives you a license to do Y, which is examine all this other stuff. There's no reason that couldn't have been done with the pure historicals, but, I think in general this period suffers from that lack of a big idea and that lack of that sort of drift. And yeah, I say it's unfortunate that the historicals kind of expose the lack of any of that. The worst.
Just from my point of view, to answer Jim's question, I agree with Matt that basically a good writer with a clear view on what the historical could do would
clear idea of what they want to do.
Yeah, would I think succeed. And I also think that as the Troughton era becomes the sort of base under siege slog that it seems to, maybe the odd historical wouldn't have been a bad thing.
Well, quite, because even Enemy of the World spruces things up, doesn't it, really? Just
yeah, big time. And that's the fascinating thing about... I mean, we've already discussed these, but when Web of Fear and Enemy of the World came out, were rediscovered, everyone was extremely excited about Web of Fear.
But it turns out it was...
Yeah, I mean, well, in this room at least, but yeah, it turns out for us
that's the consensus.
Yeah, it's a bit more of a pantomime-y kind of effort and helicopters and God knows what
it
else.
does feel that we've actually had... I mean, we always sort of slightly take a dump on the Troughton era when we get to this point. We have had quite a good run...
Not literally, listeners.
No. We've had quite a good run of Troughton stories that we've covered lately that I think we've enjoyed to a greater or lesser extent. So the Invasion last month, obviously. A few months ago we did The Enemy of the World. Macra Terror, I think we all had quite a lot of time for.
That's terrific.
But all of these are doing something else compared to, say... the things that we've not liked so much.
Well, they're outliers.
Well, they are outliers.
Well, except Invasion, maybe. But
you got
even that's pretty distinctive.
I think the Invasion feels like an outlier from say the model that's set up by stuff like Web of Fear, Tomb of the Cybermen, and presumably all the other sort of moon-basey type stuff that we've not come across yet.
And the other thing is Troughton himself in this, which you've both touched on the idea that here he looks like they're trying to very much make him a distinctive thing from Hartnell. He's the master of disguise. That's a little bit of a dead end. I mean, you've not seen Power of the Daleks, but again, he kind of assumes... He doesn't do the wacky Clouseau disguises like he does here, but he assumes the mantle of a dead Earth investigator who turns up at this thing. The next story, Underwater Menace, he also has a little disguise, but it's toned down a bit. This kind of is a weird thing when he's just doing it non-stop. Are you glad that didn't continue?
Well, he's got to be the Doctor at some point.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to settle who the character is, it's a strange idea to have him basically pretend to be other people for 80% of it.
Yeah. I don't know if it's just that Troughton was known as this sort of versatile character actor, and I thought, well, that'll be a chance to sort of see where we could go with
show
him
his
and settle
range,
on one of them. And it's something Hartnell wouldn't have done, probably. But the odd thing is, because we have discussed the Troughton era quite a bit recently, we're not that keen on the scripts because of the base Under Siege thing seems a bit repetitive, and it's we don't enjoy it as much as the Hartnell, which has a lot of variety in it. Fan consensus seems to be that Troughton and the Second Doctor are fantastic because of his acting and the idea that the terms that tend to get used are he's impish, he's a trickster, and he's a kind of anarchistic figure of some sort. And it is, going back to what Matt said, when he's in disguise as the physician and he's sort of banging the guy's head on the desk, he reminded me of nothing so much as kind of Bugs Bunny or Daffy Duck or something.
Yeah.
Going back to what I've just said there, do you broadly through the Troughtons that we've covered, do you like that idea of him being this impish character? Because I think people like it because they're assuming that's what the Doctor kind of is set as after that.
I don't think you really see that much of his... I mean, this is the other thing. It's like... and again, to make the same point again about the sort of overall drift that crops up in the Troughton era. Yeah, I completely agree that just having him constantly playing other people for 80% of the time does not offer a sustainable, that's not a sustainable character base. I generally find, I think Troughton's a very good actor. I think he's a particularly good television actor. I think he actually has quite a modern style of acting. He doesn't feel very rep in the way that still a lot of the kind of supporting cast of this era do. But I don't.
He did the era of Time in the Rani.
That's also true. Which wait till we get to that. He's quite a modern television actor, I think. But the characterization of the Doctor was, other than just the fact that he's small and his physical abilities to scuttle around quite a bit maybe give him this sort of surface air of impishness, but I think he just becomes quite sort of blandly avuncular later on. I don't really think there's much meat on the bones, and that's why actually here it's not so much that I want to see him do more of being in disguise all the time, but there's that real sense of he's almost like a sort of it's almost quite sort of dangerous kind of thrill junkie, kind of like always just getting a kick out of just being one millisecond ahead of everyone else and enjoying that is what I enjoyed about it here, because it is different to see him, I don't know, just like sort of throw himself into it this much. Whereas again, I think later just the lack of, as the performance calms down, that's where it really starts to expose the lack of a big idea, I think.
Because I am fascinated with this idea that fans love him because he's a force of destruction or something. He's just in there to cause trouble and stir things up.
He is
I'm
here,
not sure if it's...
But he's not later.
Not particularly. I mean, you can grasp at straws and find examples of it, but I'm just sure if it's somewhat telling that we've been doing this podcast for over 3 years now, but we seem very much on the side of Pertwee and Hartnell's doctors, who are the far more... I think they're seen as a bit too traditional by a lot of fans, whereas I think there's something very...
I think they are more
they're rather more
anarchic than the
subversive
second
in their
Doctor.
way. Yeah,
they are subversive.
Yeah, they're less showy about it.
I was just thinking that, with the second Doctor, there's this kind of sense that he is in many ways the first of the Doctors to have that childlike quality, as if there is a direct connection between the Doctor and the child audience.
It's bullshit as well, though, isn't it?
Well, no, hang on. Let me. What I'm saying is, Hartnell. There's a huge amount of affection for Hartnell from the audience, obviously, and kids would, mob him if they saw him in the street, whatever. But he's not a childlike beast, right? I mean,
Occasionally
when he chuckles to himself or whatever, but it is kind of an eccentric older person rather than a childlike take on the world. And I think that people connect with the perception that that's what Troughton's Doctor does, and he's a slightly wackier costume and the sort of pinned on bow tie and all that sort of stuff. It's the beginning of the Doctor as a kind of childlike figure, or the perception of the Doctor as a kind of childlike figure, and B, that he's a kind of bohemian. And so you see this ripple through that. Obviously the fourth Doctor, the wacky Matt Smith and his zany retorts.
I'm impressed you remember that from the song. Yes.
So wacky Matt Smith, they reference the second Doctor there quite a bit. And actually, I think that sort of zany, crazy view... I mean, I was saying to Matt only the other day how actually a lot more of the fourth Doctor stuff kind of leaves me cold than I thought it would. It's not to say there's a lot of it, so a lot of it's good. A lot of it for me isn't so good. But I think that when Doctor Who tries a bit too hard to do that, hey, the Doctor's a crazy, childlike, bohemian, crazy kind of person, it kind of doesn't really work. And actually when the Doctor is a kind of elite establishment authority figure who's secretly on your side and can use that kind of devilishness, I just find it a bit more effective, really.
But also, I mean, I think we made this point very early on about the Troughton era, is that I think it lingers very well in the sort of fan memory because, it certainly does set a template that echoes down for attitudes towards how the character's written. And typically, when you see, like, a fan video or someone is where they've got like a non-actor or a semi or an amdram person playing.
We're doing Tom and the Rani later.
Oh yes, perfect. Yeah. Well, I mean, case in point, they want with the Seventh Doctor, their initial brief was to revisit the Troughton idea. That seems to be a lot of people's reflexive first port of call is something a bit Troughtonish.
But it's like there's a folk memory of him rather than actually people...
Of course there is, because
or a Target Novels memory of him.
It's because we can't watch it. It's because we can't see it and actually see that a lot of it is... And that also allows us to forget that a lot of it, especially later on, was a ratings bust. It didn't resonate with the mass audience in the way that Hartnell did or the way that Pertwee did. No one particularly liked it, and a lot of it wasn't very good.
I think,
but shorn of the evidence now, thanks to the BBC's wiping policy, we could say, "Oh yeah, it was great."
And also,
it's been redacted.
it's an unoriginal point. I've heard it made many times before, but I think, and there's no reason why this ought to be true of everything. But certainly, in my opinion, Doctor Who tends to be at its best when it's also a ratings hit.
Yes,
like its creative successes match perfectly its commercial or viewer success.
Yes.
I think.
Yeah, it's working with a mainstream audience and not just its fans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it seems to be, I don't know whether that's because when it does that, it's not going down continuity, fan service, or sci-fi rabbit holes, but having to deal with characters and emotions and
I think it's
moral questions.
I
don't know.
When it comes up with a big idea that resonates, I think it's as simple as that.
But I think it's a testament to how slight the Highlanders is, that we've spent more time discussing the era, other Doctors, how this parallels the legacy of Troughton than the Highlanders, because I don't think there is a lot there.
The Tardis is just a little small box, you know, but it's bigger in the studio. It was in Lime Grove. It was a lot bigger in Lime Grove. That sounded like two warthogs, you know, the male warthog chatting a female warthog up with a hippo trying to get it on the act, I think. And then the hippo would join it.
From the Highlands of Scotland to London, is it meant to be South London?
Yeah, SE15
South
is
London.
one of the... I spotted the postcode.
Isn't that near where you live, or is that?
Yeah, it's near where I work as well.
Ah,
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is Father's Day, broadcast 14th of May 2005. Obviously, Christopher Eccleston is the Doctor. Keen to meet the father she never knew, Rose pleads with the Doctor to take her back to 1987 on the day that Pete Tyler, her dad, died, killed by a hit and run. And there's a bit of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey. Rose prevents the accident, which triggers a fracture in time, which leads these dragon-like... What are they called? The
Reapers?
The Reapers. The dragon-like... Are they actually called the Reapers at all at any point in the story?
I don't think so.
Good question.
I can't remember. It's one of those things that you know from when it came, because there's a lot of publicity around it, so you just kind of assume.
Write in if you want to rewatch this just to find out that fact.
That's the premise of it. What I'm more interested in, Jim, as a South London resident, did you feel that the collection of characters nailed the South London accent? What, this time of night, south of the river? Hey.
Yeah, I liked all that. I mean, I wasn't living in London in 1987, but the first thing I want to say about this is whoever did the haircuts for it.
Oh, they nailed it, didn't they?
Especially the guy playing the groom, Stuart, and his dad.
Oh, his dad!
Like, their haircuts are so bang on that it almost like transforms their faces, because you think, that guy's not from now.
Well,
No.
apparently they got the
quite-
cast to bring in photos of themselves in the 80s and then recreated what they had, which is a genius move.
Because
I think.
we'll talk more in depth about the story later. But yeah, the one thing that lets it down there is Jackie, who her hair probably is accurate for the period, but she doesn't really carry it off that she looks 20 years younger in it. But you know, it can't be helped. It's still a fantastic conceit of Rose meeting her when she herself's only a few months old, presumably.
It's interesting mentioning the 80s setting. Am I right in thinking that outside of Remembrance of the Daleks, which is very consciously joining up with the events of 1963, i.e. what was
the
happening?
first time it's set in its own history?
Yeah, first time Doctor Who is set in its own living history.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Which I remember being quite striking at the time, of feeling like, you know, that history for Doctor Who now includes, you know, the 70s and the 80s and
oddly,
the
of course,
90s. I think,
Remembrance
as well.
was set during the beginning of Doctor Who. It's kind of, this is around when Remembrance is set as well. It's a little, it would actually been Delta and the Bannerman, I think, being broadcast, but that kind of neck of the woods.
Do you like this, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's the first series of the comeback season, and we think people know my views on that. I really love Eccleston as the Doctor. I'm going to say, because we only tend to do one Eccleston a year or something, because they're quite a sort of endangered species. Not as much as the Highlanders was that. The more we look at Tennant and Smith and Capaldi's in living memory, if we can call that, whenever you go back to Eccleston, it strikes you just how kind of unusual he is as a Doctor. And it's, you know, there is, I don't know if you're aware of this, there is a bit of an online thing with, not specifically, but you know, a lot of the time it's American fans who've discovered it since the Matt Smith era. Yeah. And there's this sort of phrase, skip 9, as if you're going to catch up on Doctor Who, don't really bother with the 9th Doctor because it's not very, I don't know, representative or whatever. Just go straight in with Tennant. And yeah, he's such a fantastic Doctor. But anyway, we know all that already, but what I think of that. It's the first series, and it's still Doctor Who as a new show, saying to the audience who wouldn't really have much time for science fiction, hey, you think Doctor Who's just spaceships? We can do this as well. If you're a science fiction fan, you're going to know this kind of setup of, if you change history even slightly, it has these big ramifications. And here, you know, it's the first time the new show is doing that. I don't want to use this as a cheap chance to take pot shots at Moffat, but it's very telling that if he did you can imagine a story like this now would be about the cleverness of time going around in a loop or something. It would somehow all resolve itself anyway, and the thing that solved it would be there. You know what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Whereas this doesn't care about that. It's very much in a Sapphire and Steel kind of mood of how time works, which is just make it up as you're going along.
Totally.
Come up with a bunch of surreal and striking images.
It's very much
which
science
just get across
fantasy.
Yeah, absolutely. And what it cares about is the characters and the drama. It is Rose meeting her dad and finding his really disappointing.
Yes.
And not just that, but then when after hearing her mom go on about how fantastic he was, the fact that they absolutely hate each other at this point. And obviously no one in the real world's going to be in this situation of meeting a dead parent, but there are precedents of meeting long-lost family members or people you didn't grow up with, or anything in life when you had a sort of set idea of it in your head and then find it to be a huge disappointment. And we are doing Tom and the Rani later.
Speaking of 1987.
But yeah,
Indeed.
I think broadly that's my take on it.
Yeah.
Again, it's one of these shows you go back 2 years later, and I liked it at the time, but now it just really great, yeah.
I mean, I'd possibly slightly say that, I mean, you sort of say that the science fiction element of it, you sort of slightly hand-wave that away. I mean, what I would say is, from looking around, I seem to find only positive reaction to this. I remember it being somewhat divisive at the time, because there definitely was a review, possibly in SFX, that kind of wrote this off as, quote-unquote, a shallow weepy. And the idea that that Doctor Who was bringing more sort of soap opera techniques into the mix that somehow sat in opposition to science fiction. And I really do think that this is quite a hard science fiction idea. I mean, as I say, it's one that's been explored elsewhere, but it's not that often, I think, up until this point that, I mean, other than saying, oh yeah, we're creating a colony on the moon and something's going to go wrong there. The idea of Doctor Who...
That's a great idea, by the way, Matt. You should pitch
that
that.
I mean, that's the money maker, right?
Is that Space 1999 or Moonbase 3, the Barry Letts Terrence Dicks show?
Or the whole of the Troughton era.
Yeah.
It's actually quite a hard, solid what if that feels very, very sci-fi, from which then emotional heft is drawn. It's interesting you made the Moffat comparison. I thought much the same thing. I'm also not going to take this opportunity to take cheap pot shots at Stephen Moffat. But what I would say is that this is Doctor Who doing timey-wimey type stuff, which he had not really done that much, with the exception of a few things like Day of the Daleks up until that point. I do think that Paul Cornell takes quite a hard sci-fi view of the ramifications of messing with time.
Paul Cornell wrote this.
Yes, Paul Cornell wrote this. Whereas Stephen Moffat, as a writer of sitcom, I think is more... it's a realisation I only had watching this, actually, is more drawn to almost like the farce elements of it. So the kind of French farce aspect of people going in one door, coming out the other, just missing each other. That is how he structures his time travel stories. It's that idea of everything.
It sounds like the Romans, the way you describe it.
Well, no, but I think what you mean is the grammar. Even when he's not aiming for funny, that's how he.
The grammar is farce
Yeah.
of how certainly those kind of timey-wimey stories, for want of a better phrase, is how Moffat structures those things. I mean, I love this, and it really, I mean, genuinely, it had me in bits in 2005, and I'm not ashamed to say that I cried again this morning watching this. I think it takes that core idea, which is really only something that a time travel show can do. So that's why I was just quite keen to say at the top, it's not disregarding the sci-fi in the favour of the soap opera theatrics. Something like this could only happen in a sci-fi show about a time traveller with a time machine, and really just rings not in a massively theatrical way, but just wrings as much impact and drama out of that as possible. Sean Dingwall as Pete Tyler and Billy Piper are absolutely extraordinary. It's got one of the most wrenching, I think, shots in the whole of Doctor Who, where Joe Ahern, the director, just keeps the camera on Pete's face for what seems like 20 or 30 seconds in a single unbroken shot as the penny drops as he's watching the car going round and round outside. I mean, it's such a long shot, that. And as he realises the cogs are turning, and he realises what he has to do in order to put this entire situation right. It's quite a small cast of characters. Each of them get their moment. I mean, I think that scene where the Doctor says, "Oh, waiting for a taxi at 2 a.m. outside a nightclub. I've never had that kind of life." I think
well,
that's
he did in the
common for
War
some
Machines
prisoners.
when he left the Inferno Club.
That's very
yeah. He found a dead tramp
how
shortly
quickly
after.
we
Come on,
forget.
let's-
Yes. I've seen that come in for some criticism, but I love that.
Again, it's striking now that you're watching Eccleston as a kind of performing it in a very working class kind of way. They're not trying to make him a received pronunciation kind of delivery. And also the whole setup of the series is Rose is from a rather an extraordinary background, but has the right stuff. And it felt like they didn't need this thing on top of it to say, I love everybody, even if they have filled down on themselves.
I don't know. But I loved it. Anyway, John, do you like this?
I don't think that's what's going on here, because actually the whole point of the story is that one small change, this supposedly insignificant person staying alive rather than dying, that one change can have huge ramifications. So he's making...
That's exactly what she says. He didn't start World War III or anything. Isn't that the line that she has?
Exactly. Yeah. But it has huge ramifications, and I think that's the context through which the Doctor is saying... You have what we could be described as a normal life, but you could have an extraordinary impact, or your lives will be extraordinary to each other, and you will have an impact beyond what, your life is more important than even you might think it is. So I think it fits dramatically with the scope of I think it does. But then I just loved every part of this. I don't wish to dissent, really, from either of your positions on this. I think that the RTD polish on the writing, you've personally, I feel. I mean, I don't know the degree to which Paul Cornell has done some of this stuff, but when the groom's dad says on his huge brick of a mobile phone, "Well, knocked her up" is a phrase I'd use. It's just the way it's emphasised and everything. It's just brilliant. And when they're worried about the fact that very few people are from the church, very few people have made it to the church, they say, "No one from the Lamb and Flag." It's just little stuff like that. And the standout scene for me is the one between Rose and Pete, where she's describing that he was the best dad in the world and read all the stories every night, and
you can tell on his face he doesn't.
Well, yeah, as Matt has said, Sean Dingwall it's a knockout performance. I mean, and Billy Piper, but Sean Dingwall as the guest,
he's amazing. Really
brings it. Yeah, he's incredible. And when he says, "That's not me," it's just that it's bleak as fuck. It's just so... And the funny thing is about it, though, that she is disappointed by him, but she's only disappointed by him versus the inevitable...
The idealised version.
The inevitably idealised version of him after he died and what have you. In the same way that only brilliant family man people or gifted children who are going to go on to Oxford seem to get killed too young. They're never actually, this guy was an arse. He was cut off far from his prime. He was like, that's the way we deal with, that's the way we deal with the absence of somebody. That's how we deal with their death, right? An idealized version, because that's the polite thing to do. It's the way to try and heal that wound.
Yes, you carve away all the sort of crappy and inconvenient stuff, and you're left with just that sort of warm glow, aren't you?
That's the human way to deal with something like that. So she's disappointed versus that, but actually the fact that he makes that final sacrifice at the end proves that she has no right to be dissatisfied with who he really is.
Especially because she could put him in that situation in the first place.
Well, yeah, but when he says...
He's going to save the world, but that wouldn't have been a thing.
But he's not saving the world, he's saving his daughter. I mean, he is saving the world, but in plot terms. But in the thematic...
He presents his,
that's
do the
what
right thing
he
for her.
Yeah. That bit where he explains his decision and said, "Look, I've had all these extra hours. I've got to do something that no one else has done, and I've got to meet you." And it's like, oh my God, I was like really welling up at that.
You see, for me, it's much more. I mean, I came to this, just cards on the table. I have a fairly complicated relationship with my father, and this kind of rang a lot of chime. There was a lot of chiming sort of moments for me, and that moment where she says, "Look, this is all my fault," and he says, "No, I'm your dad. It's my job for it to be my fault." That feels like the moment where he steps up and is her father.
Which is apparently a line that, according to something I read, Cornell's father actually said to him at one point. It's like, so it has that kind of tang of something real to it.
Yeah. And for me, that is what it is to be a parent. It's that, I am here for you. I will It feels so real, like you say. I'm not
and
surprised.
when it counts,
that
he is.
And when
He
it counts,
there
he
for
is.
it, yeah.
And so you take the rough with the smooth, but at the end of the day, he's there for her. And the fact that he was taken before she could ever have known him, that's particularly cruel, because he would have been there for her. He might not have read her the stories and taken her to picnics every week in the countryside, but ultimately he would have been there for her. And so for him to be plucked away is very sad. To talk about the Doctor for a second, I can't actually get over people saying that you could skip 9. The Doctor is profoundly ill. I mean, really ill, like really mentally ill.
In terms of not getting how terrible an idea this is.
No, at the very beginning, like, and particularly in those first sort of 3 or 4 minutes, 5 minutes, he is unbelievably reckless. This is not something that a previous...
There's something really creepy about the "your wish is my command" kind of thing. And
be careful what you wish for,
yeah,
which is what he says.
And he knows exactly the extent to which it's got the potential to fuck up, and he exposes them both to that.
But it's that sort of out of phase, that he's sort of out of phase with who he is and what's going on, that makes it such an interesting characterization and a brave thing to do when you're introducing this character for the first time. In this series, I mean, you're introducing the character for the first time, and you've got this real nuance, break from the past. He's a complicated guy struggling with loads of issues.
Although he is that, I mean, that you say it's not so much... I mean, when you say about introducing the character, it almost implies that because ultimately you want to get to a point where he is the Doctor that we know and love. I mean, he's the reintroduction of the Doctor. For most of the audience at this point, he's just the Doctor, the only Doctor.
Yeah.
And all of that baggage, I mean, that's the story of this Doctor. That stuff doesn't really go away until he's got the moment to actually redeem it all and regenerate at the end of the series. But, those ideas... think to the Dalek episode, what is that, a couple of weeks earlier? That's 2 weeks earlier than this. Yeah. Which ends with another really crushing moment where the Doctor is about to blast the newly humanized Dalek to pieces, and it's Rose that pulls him up on, like, what the fuck are you doing? Can't you see that this thing has changed? It's full of him making those kind of wrong calls because his head is emotionally in entirely the wrong place. And, I find it partly because, I mean, I think already with the David Tennant era, the modern series did very quickly slip back into that conception of what the classic Doctor is. I mean, David Tennant... He's an impish trickster. Who's got, I mean, to drag out that fucking Terrance Dicks line again, which it feels like I've heard more times in the last couple of years than I ever need to, about him never being cruel or cowardly or unkind, all of this kind of stuff. I find it interesting whether or not, had they done a second series with Christopher Eccleston, whether they were aiming to move it to a point where he becomes the sort of classic style Doctor that we know and love, or whether, this idea that the Doctor is a psychologically complex and quite damaged individual is something that they were looking to carry forward.
Yeah, he's cracked, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's a cracked mirror.
But the new series, it does sort of settle into that kind of classic Doctor, the sort of Troughton cliche that we were talking about earlier, with all of them, even when they're trying to do something a bit different, like with the Capaldi Doctor. Whereas here, you are seeing something very different, and I like it.
Well, it's almost like, when they talk about the characterization of the Sixth Doctor as sort of unpleasant or weird,
he's
or spiky. With this, it's almost like the decision to make him not quite, to have things wrong with him, to have flaws in his character, is just so much better handled here, and it's balanced by a genuine charm. And when he's talking to the couple that are going to get married. And
he's
also
a deeply likeable presence, isn't he, as well?
Yeah, he's just flawed, but he's not he's not nasty, he's just flawed, and the thing that really tells you where the Doctor's hearts really lie is when Pete said, the Doctor must have figured this out a long time ago, that it has to be me that dies. But the Doctor couldn't bring himself to
say, right, you got to cop it.
Or to tell, because he couldn't do that to Rose. And so that also is a powerful thing that tells us so much about the Doctor, with the Doctor not even being in the scene. I mean, it's just it's a masterclass, isn't it? The initial argument between Jackie and Pete outside the church is so beautifully written, and it's so bleak. It's so dark. It's so realistic about a relationship where the cogs just aren't grinding well together.
And we don't praise him that often. Murray Gold's music at that point, I think, is really good as well. It's that kind of
it's very
music box
restrained
winding
generally,
down, and it's just showing things falling apart in Rose's head as she watches it. It underlines it nicely.
Clever. The music's really good throughout, actually, in this. And I think in a thing that's got... I seem to remember reading somewhere that Davis's brief to Paul Cornell was to do something that had echoes of his kind of New Adventures novels. And I think... it's been a long time since I've read any of them, but I do remember one of the things that he... beyond the religious imagery that's suffused through all of his books, which obviously so much of it's set in the church, the Doctor preaching to the congregation from the pulpit, waving the Tardis key like it's...
I do love the fact that every time he wants to speak to people, he jumps into the pulpit.
Yeah, it's great fun. But, the Cornell's gift from his novels, I seem to remember, was creating this sort of... these kind of dreamlike but quite unsettling images. Famously, the Seventh Doctor finding the crucified Fifth Doctor on the moon in that first novel.
Is it on the moon, or you get mixed up with the Ninth Configuration? There,
maybe
I know he's crucified.
He finds the crucified Fifth Doctor somewhere. This is absolutely stuffed full of them, like the car just continually going round and round in a loop, which is amazing. It's a weird image, and I think the audience knows kind of what it's about as well before the But also hearing the phone call, the Watson come here, I need you, which is misquoted, but we'll let it pass because it does work really well here.
Time's out of joint.
Exactly, time's out of joint.
The empty TARDIS is great.
The empty TARDIS is phenomenal. It's like when he goes in and bangs all the doors, and apparently the original idea for that was that he was going to open the door and it would just collapse into all the pieces of an empty police box, but they realised they didn't have the money to do that. But the empty... It's the shocking thing is that this supposedly everyday object is that the TARDIS is not magical.
Yeah,
and then
it tells you exactly how much trouble they're in.
Yeah. And, there was...
Well, the Reapers themselves as well.
Yes, the Reapers themselves are interesting. I think, yes, for the way they kind of have that almost sort of demonic... They feel more symbolic than Doctor Who monsters normally are.
I mean, they're kind of Lord of the Rings-ish.
Yes.
Maybe I'm talking absolute rubbish.
But they also sort of feel like this kind of Book of Revelation type kind of...
If something like that happened, which obviously it wouldn't, you'd imagine time would just... immediately. The fact they've gone to the point where these kind of weird dragon-like creatures which are doing a peck and hunt on people, you think, why? And why are they distracted by a church? Because it's meant to be old. But it's just a great visual that there's a proper monster in there, and there's a threat, and the shadows of them through the stained glass windows is fantastic as well, And
it does have this kind of... the whole thing is suffused. It's so wonderfully directed by Joe Ahern, which I think is one of the great tragedies that they never persuaded him to come back and do more Doctor Who, because I think all of the stuff he directed for Series 1 is phenomenal, and he also... Well, I think famously got on incredibly well with Christopher Eccleston, which is possibly why they kept bringing him back for more and more episodes. But just so much of it is kind of beautifully shot, but in this kind of quite... There's something about the colour palette that's just kind of slightly washed out, slightly dreamlike. It's kind of got this hazy, kind of cold, you're not quite sure...
Well, that's what 1987 was like.
Oh, is it really?
Let me tell you. Yeah.
No third term for Thatcher.
No third term for Thatcher.
I saw the Socialist Worker posters that were all up in the...
Yeah.
Oh, and the Bad Wolf reference there as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the church as a place of sanctuary, the fact that Pete is an ordinary man in his early 30s who dies to save us all through his own sacrifice.
Oh,
there's quite a lot of religious imagery in this.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say the little details in it, like when they go back to the flat and the horrible drawings on the wall.
Yeah.
There's a few things there that looks like it's trying to be a little sophisticated. And not
I really loved the
third place in the bowling and that kind of.
The first two went to Didcot.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all fabulous stuff. But I mean, this is I tend to agree with. Well, both of you really. I mean, I do agree that it's only because it's a sci-fi show that's playing with time that you get to do this story.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it ticks a sci-fi box. But I agree with Jim that once it gets you to that point, it doesn't care anymore that it's sci-fi. And the fact it isn't like he builds a machine that goes ding when there's stuff and everything's better, or he reverses the polarity of the neutron. Like that. That's not what. But this almost, is. It requires a very human, emotional moment to save the day.
But also, I mean, I'm on slightly, as I say, and I really kind of hammered the science fiction point on that. I'm sort of on quite a big tip at the minute of trying to read more literary sci-fi, because it's, you know, I've always considered myself a fan of science fiction, but, you know, it's only really film and TV stuff that I know. There's a lot of the great novels that I've never read. But I've just been reading some Joanna Russ, and I'm currently in the middle of some sort of Ursula Le Guin. To me, that sort of the books I'm trying to pick really do sort of pin down. They're all hard sci-fi essentially, but only in that sense that, to me, what sci-fi does is just allow you to have that free arena to set up an idea, and then the sci-fi business gets out the way. I'm not really prepared to engage with it on the terms of like arguing with people that think this was too soap opera-y, because only science fiction can get you this story is not just to say, and then the science fiction pisses off and it's all about the human drama. Only sci-fi can raise you to that level of emotional extremity where you'll get this. And that's to me why I love science fiction so much, is that you know, you will never get even the things that do hit those heights of emotion of, you know, Mike Leigh or something like that. They'll never get you to this point, because science fiction can only take you further up. And that's, to me, the emotion. I've probably not explained that very well, but the emotional core of this can only come from it being science fiction. The only downer that it left me on, so I may as well throw in something that I didn't like, is that it reminded me of what a bloody stupid idea it was to bring P. Tyler back the following year.
Yeah, it does undercut it a bit, yeah.
And then everything, I mean, obviously doing a shit sequel or bringing him back doesn't negate the good things of the original, but it does just remind you what a bloody stupid idea that was to try and unpick this and go a little further with it, especially in a crappy Cyberman story.
Bring it back to Troughton.
And we're back to the Troughton era.
Hello, I'm Paul Cornell, novelist, TV writer and comicer. I think I most relate to Clara, because that's kind of how I'd be. I'm still a bit scared of the brain of Morbius, because that was my first one, and it got into my nightmares, and it's. I saw a guy cosplaying it at a convention really late at night. I was looking around kind of, anybody else see this? I love Kate Bush. I love Thunderbirds A Go, the new series. I love cricket.
You've endured us talking about the Highlanders and Father's Day. This is what you came for, isn't it? This is the main event.
Pay-per-view.
Pay-per-view. Yeah, we should put this out as a premium episode. We could make some money.
They pay you to watch it.
Well, I did buy the DVD of this, so technically I paid to watch this.
It's got some good docs on.
It has.
Yeah.
In case you were wondering, we are going from fictional 1987 to actual 1987 for Time and the Rani, the debut Sylvester McCoy story, in which the evil Rani drags the Tardis to planet Lacertia, causing the Doctor to regenerate into his seventh incarnation. Taking advantage of the Doctor's confused state, the Rani sets him to work on her scheme to use a strange matter asteroid and the brains of history's greatest geniuses to control time. Meanwhile, Mel, his assistant, wins the trust of the oppressed locals, whilst trying to avoid the Rani's deadly booby traps and the horrible tetraps, her bat-like henchmen. Couple of things to note here. I mean, first of all, this is, well, it's the launch of a whole new era, really, isn't it? It's after the less than stellar reception of Trial of the Time Lord, the BBC decides to give Doctor Who one last roll of the dice, insisting that Colin Baker be sacked and a new actor be brought in, and the production team generally up its game. This is the result. So
you did well to keep a straight face during all
we
that.
Do have, yeah. I mean, it's got
a reputation.
This has a reputation. I mean, this is variously considered, if not the worst, certainly one of the worst. I mean, for a long time, it was in a bit of a two-horse race with the Twin Dilemma for what
both those horses now turned into dog food.
I think the Twin Dilemma pulled away in the final furlong.
Yes, no one likes this. It's a bit of a mess. Jim,
hello,
31 years on. Well, actually, first of all, did you watch this when it went out?
Yes, even though, as you say, Trial of the Time Lord, not great, and I'd certainly fallen out of love with Doctor Who during Trial and to some extent the first Colin Baker season as well. I mean, it wasn't a good show at that point, but I was becoming a teenager and, you know, interesting in other stuff. So yeah, I'd fallen out of love with it, but I was still... Oh God, no. I did watch this in the way that when you've split up with someone, you might go, oh, they're still single, but it's just keeping tabs on them. And you're watching this, you think, oh right, that's why I did. So yeah, it was
Glad you didn't extend that metaphor.
I didn't know
for what your former partner had now turned into. Yeah,
Sylvester McCoy. My God. So yeah, I watched this more with a bit of a distance to it, and just thinking, God, this is awful, isn't it? I think even when they'd announced Sylvester McCoy was playing it, I remembered I was very familiar with him from Tiswas and various BBC shows he was doing as well. And I remember thinking, God, this feels like they've just found anyone to do it. So like, at least Colin Baker was an actor with a bit of a background to him, which I know people that McCoy had done other stuff as well. But yeah, it really did feel like...
You're overlooking his stage work.
Exactly, yeah. It did really feel like this was just a last-ditch attempt to kind of do something so it's there, but not put a lot of work into it. I've got to say, I remember later on in this, maybe by about the third episode, kind of just thinking, the Doctor's still kind of a good character, isn't he? It's a shame it isn't, there was something there. I remember kind of liking the fact he had a proper outfit rather than the Colin Baker one.
That is a big step up when he gets gets rid of the Colin Baker coat.
But
you don't even see him take it off.
I am skirting around the main issue here. Yeah, this is a very bad story. It's Pip and Jane Baker,
our old friends.
As usual with them, it's a very pulp B-movie kind of sci-fi setup. It's in the Flash Gordon kind of mould. And in fact, all of their stories are about mad geniuses with a big plan to have some terrible scheme. Obviously, there are the story Mark of the Rani. Mm-hmm. Terror of the Vervoids has Honor Blackman pretty much as the Rani. She's a sort of scientist who's hell-bent on crossbreeding people with vegetables or something. And obviously they were thrown the last episode of Trial of the Time Lord with no idea of that. They weren't able to look at any notes of that. But again, it ends up with the Valiard as a sort of villain who's going to blow everything up. So they're not ideal. I mean, it's kind of striking to watch this, given what we now think of as the McCoy era, the Cartmel, and those much younger writers who were keen to get some kind of
this was commissioned by John Nathan Turner
because
he didn't have a script editor and didn't have anything to work from.
Yeah, and was intended for Colin Baker. I think he was still going to have the plot of him losing his memory and stuff. And I think, from what I gather from the documentaries around this, Cartmel didn't like this, tried to change it, and what ended up with something he didn't like and Pip and Jane didn't like. But yeah, it's kind of a mess. But the main thing I want to say is this takes us right back to the first podcast we did with Twin Dilemma. We all picked a sort of an ill-thought-of Doctor Who story and tried to come up with a defence of it. And as you say, this is very close in critical stock to Twin Dilemma. I'm going to say it has a lot of the same effect for me. I've watched this many times because it is so bloody awful. And I think that's important. I know it sounds snarky to watch something and say, oh, it's so bad, it's good. But I think...
hate watching it now, isn't it? That's what you call it.
Is that what it's
the
called?
Modern vernacular.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that takes the fun out of it. But I think when you are a big enough fan of Doctor Who, it's important to keep your fandom in check to make sure it doesn't get out of hand. And obviously, if you're doing a podcast about it, you obviously are taking it quite seriously. So I think
you tell us.
I think it is important to watch something like this and genuinely just enjoy the fact that the love of your life can do something as awful as this and not try and make excuses for it. So there's kind of some interesting ideas here. It is just hilariously bad a lot of the time. Quite what makes it hilariously bad, I'm sure we will unpick over the next sort of half an hour or so. But yeah, that's my hot take.
Sure.
30 odd years later.
John.
I think that this is...
Your arms are firmly folded as you say this.
I think that this contains the worst acting performance, not just in Doctor Who, but that I have ever seen.
Oh, there are quite a few contenders.
Join us after the break to find out.
And the nominations are...
This character is only in episode 1.
Oh.
It's Karen Clegg as San.
She's awful.
That is shocking. I mean, she can barely say the lines, let alone deliver them.
To the extent that when she runs off with her arms by her side, which we later find out is how the Persians run, I just thought she can't even run.
I literally thought the same thing. It's like she can't even run. She can't even run. She can't speak. She can't run. What can she do?
Wasn't our previous contender for worst actor in Doctor Who ever was also from this season was the woman from Dragonfire?
You don't like the Rocky Horror woman, do you? I can't think of her name.
Let's talk about the dialogue. The dialogue is not good.
Well, it's Pip and Jane.
It's stuff that was never written for a human to say.
I've written my note is the dialogue is full of stuff that no one said ever. It's
The
just
first time it's ever been said out loud.
And lots of exposition as well, is it?
truly. I mean, I don't much like McCoy, but if you know, I watched something like Curse of Fenric, where I think there is quality up there. It's a bit of a mess, but
Yeah.
there's stuff going
There's
on.
Nicholas Parsons.
Yeah, well, Nicholas Parsons is very good at it. But there's stuff going on. There's a bit of a read on the performance. McCoy isn't. Let's say he's a limited actor.
You're being quite generous.
I'm being quite generous. He is embarrassing in this.
It's dire, his performance.
He is embarrassing.
I mean, even with
even
the sense that
even
he's
acknowledging
been thrown in at the deep end on script, clearly a script that didn't have any read on what it was
That
going
would
to
have been a better start.
But even allowing for all of the faults which don't involve him, and I'll give him the pass that this is a terrible script.
Yeah.
You know, you're in having to polish a turd territory.
Yes.
And as we all know, you can at best lacquer a turd.
Well, Stanley Kubrick said you can if you freeze it.
Even taking that into account, he does very little to try and raise it, make it better than it could be. Nothing connects in the sense of dramatic flow. There isn't really a story. There's meant to be a sense of mystery about what's behind Kate O'Mara's door. Again, that's like euphemism.
That was Shakin' Stevens' B-side, wasn't it?
Behind Kate O'Mara's door. But I just don't care what's behind her door.
But it is a shocking revelation.
Well, I mean, a giant bubbling brain that speaks.
But how is it that you see now? But a giant bubbling brain that speaks should be catnip for me.
Yeah.
But somehow I don't care. Oh, it's a talking brain. I should love a talking brain.
Well,
why don't I love the talking brain? I don't. It's just like...
Is it because empirical thinking is the barrier to understanding time?
I think that's what it is, Jim.
Mm-hmm.
I think that'll be what it is. There's an overwhelming sense of evil. Yeah, okay, mate. All the stuff about him getting the proverbs wrong because he's not quite set yet.
Oh no, I wish they'd carried that across the rest of the era, like Troughton disguising himself every 30 seconds.
It's absence makes the nose grow longer. I mean, it's like funny business that's not funny, which, as we've always said, you know. Mel, I mean, there's one line that says, "If you don't stop squawking," and you're like, well, yeah. Because I know people have a go at her for just sort of screaming, but really that is all she's good for. I don't think it's as entertainingly bad as Twin Dilemma either, which kind of is annoying for me, because if something's this bad, I feel it should be, you know. But I just don't feel there's anything quite... I don't know, there's not... I can't quite put my finger on it, why I didn't find this... You know, I laughed out loud watching Twin Dilemma. This I was just baffled by. You know, it's just there's a weird sort of it's almost like they're trying to make a socio-political point when they're all in the leisure zone.
The leisure zone.
Yeah.
An indulgent system provides all. I don't know if they were arch Thatcherites or something.
But you can see how thrilling it is there.
Oh yeah, I mean they're all they've got chaise longue, they've got
A hammock?
There's
some
a hammock.
patio furniture.
Oh yeah, no, I mean
and a disco ball that has green bees in it.
The thought that's gone into providing the pleasure. I mean, I'm just saying that they set the bar low, the Lacurtians, in terms of what keeps them happy. Any of the action, and this, I guess, I suppose we should lay this one at Andrew Morgan, the director's door. But anything that involves action or fighting or slipping or tripping, there seems to be a deliberate...
There's a lot of that.
There's a lot of it, and it's all bad. And
are you not impressed with the Rani's balls?
No, and they clearly went for a kind of slapstick fight, because famously they were thinking about whether it should be Ken Campbell, right? And they couldn't get Ken Campbell, I suppose, so they went with the next best thing.
I don't think they wanted Ken Campbell.
Well, no, but they seem to have gone for like
Poor man's Ken Campbell.
a Ken Campbell tribute act, basically, right? Which is what Sylvester McCoy is. And they've gone, okay, well, because of that, and because of we'll go for a kind of slapstick style for him. So the fighting is in slapstick. He trips in slapstick. He plays the fucking spoons twice, and also this highly intricate instrumentation, very scientific, has clearly got two spoons that someone in the art department has carved a couple of notches in. Right,
Space spoons.
Why didn't they just buy a fork?
It's useful to have a set of salad tongs at the ready in case she needs to. In case her machine fails or something.
At various points, I kept asking myself, what is this about? And more importantly, who cares? Because I certainly didn't. Like, they didn't have a sense of what they were aiming for. There's no thematic meat. there isn't an interesting plot, so it doesn't serve any purpose. We were saying earlier about the Highlanders sort of setting up the Doctor. This doesn't do that. It kind of just... He's just weird. He's just weird, isn't he? He's just a bit sort of... He rolls his R's and he's a bit odd.
Can I have a crack at this, John?
The tetraps. Sorry, just one thing. The tetraps. My wife had a good read on them. They're like Alf gone wrong, which made me laugh. But yeah, no. The one I will end my little monologue here by saying, by far and away the most interesting thing about this, I thought,
these are more notes than the BBC actually gave to the production.
Was that Mark
cast a new Doctor?
Mark Greenstreet,
yes,
who plays...
I can't remember the character's
Icona?
name. He's the main...
Icona, yeah. Auditioned for James Bond.
As James Bond, you mean?
Yes, he auditioned to be James Bond in The Living Daylights.
Wow. But he got the second best role.
Of 1987.
Yeah. Piers Brosnan went for this role originally, but he was tied into Remington Steele.
And the design work, I mean, the Laconians, is it? Laconians?
The Lacurtians.
Whatever.
Yeah. You're not sure if they're meant to be wearing a weird helmet or if they just couldn't be bothered quite disguising where the actor's head stopped. And
they're meant to be part reptile, aren't they?
Yes.
So they've got some felt circles sort of tacked onto their faces.
Especially when it's an actor like Donald Pickering, who you recognise sorts of the stuff. He was in The Face the Swans, I think.
Yeah.
And Wanda Ventham, is it?
And don't forget his
Benedict Cumberbatch's mom having to...
And don't forget his stage work.
They look rather pragmatic.
Well, I mean, I guess to play a downbeaten collaborator,
the lizard cat.
There must have been a palpable sense on set that they were downbeat collaborators. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing what they're telling us? We should break free of this.
Oh boy! All of John's points are on the money.
It's bringing us some joy, I suppose. To talk about it.
But, as we said, this was done very much on the fly. There is no plot. There's no point to it. But they weren't ever expecting it to be a regeneration story. So, I won't give it a pass, but I think there are some, there are some certain things to take into account with it.
Jim, was budget an issue on this one?
Oh, God. Well, I suppose the thing to think as well is, I mean, seriously, given how bad Trial was as a piece of TV and performance-wise, ratings... I was just amazed when they actually said, and there's a new Doctor, It's like, what? Really? This is coming back, Genuinely, it seems sort of miraculous that it came back at all, so...
Obviously, I completely agree with everything you guys have just said. In a way that only Pip and Jane Baker can do, there is an extent to which, as Jim says, they're sort of Flash Gordon-style runarounds. They're B-movie plots. I don't
think they really get Doctor Who.
No.
They don't see you can do all these other things with it. It's just, it's science fiction, so it's about
But there's
evil.
Something that they specifically bring to the table that's just...
don't clean up.
Completely batshit mental. It's not just bad, it's insane. And actually, I think so much of this is like... I've actually identified one or two qualities that I think this has, which I will proceed to. I'm sure you're going to immediately leap on me and beat me up for this because you disagree. I think there are one or two things here that there are some people involved in this production who are trying quite hard to salvage something from it. But there's just a sense to which Pip and Jane Baker just do really go the extra mile in terms of it. It's not. It's not lazy. It's just nuts.
They've looked up a thesaurus,
but this is just conceptually, it's just nuts. It's bonkers, and you got the opening. The thing I quite like about this is it's almost like a fever dream. You've got the slightly hallucinogenic CGI shots of the TARDIS being shot out of space, which are strange. It's really...
And they were at the time as well.
Yeah.
It wasn't like the CG's dated even at the time.
That's the thing. I'm not even going to say it's bad because it's one of the things about CGI is that it's still with us. So we've actually seen sort of 30 years of continual improvements on one technique as opposed to just we don't do stop motion anymore, we do this or something. It's like... So CGI dates faster than anything else. But It's weird and hallucinogenic. And then you've got the bizarre regeneration scene, which I assume it was publicised as like the first story for a new Doctor, but it's so almost incidental and comes out of nowhere. Then you've got the title sequence, which I'm going to put my cards on the table. I like the McCoy title sequence. I think actually it's pretty effective and quite well directed. But it's, again, something very different that you've not seen in Doctor Who up until this point. Just even having a title sequence with a sort of directed storyboard kind of feel to it. And a logo that is very different to anything you've seen on Doctor Who before.
I still hate the logo.
But then you crash into the main action where you've got Kate O'Mara bundling an Albert Einstein lookalike into a pod and sealing it up. And I just think, this is fucking mad. This is something. I mentioned.
What name shall I put on it? Einstein. She spells it brilliant. Yeah. How do you spell that?
Yeah. I mentioned the CGI because I think there are some aspects to which, as a relaunch for Doctor Who, there are some new production techniques being deployed here, which in some parts I think do put Doctor Who back on the front foot in terms of using new stuff and looking quite different for doing so. The CGI Tardis shots at the beginning don't work. I personally think the title sequence does work. I think there are some aspects to the production, like the fact that they can now colour in the sky pink, does give the Quarry stuff, I think, a bit of a look and atmosphere that's a bit more alien than, say, the Destiny of the Daleks Quarry stuff that we looked at last month.
Let it go.
I actually think the bubble traps are really good. The Rani's bomb thing.
They're so much more effective than just having a bomb there.
Well, I don't know, again, because I think it hits this sort of... I mean, the cliffhanger to part one sort of hits this kind of fever pitch of mentalness that you've suddenly... It's not just that, like, a bomb goes off or something. It's pinging around all over the place. The music, which is also batshit mental, is going off. Bonnie Langford is screaming at the top of her lungs. And it's like, this is nuts. But in a way that I find a lot of the Davison and Baker era to be just a bit of a plot. I think this is like spirited... vigorous horseshit. It's like, it's horseshit that on some level they have committed to an aesthetic of this being
keen to
bonkers.
Please.
And in some ways then, but so the point is, then it sort of settles down. I mean, like, by the time you're halfway through episode 2, it's just a bit of a trudge.
There's definitely one episode too many. Well, you could argue 4 episodes
The
too
first
many.
episode... I mean, it's terrible, but I was gripped by it because I just thought it's like a fever dream. It's like something's going on here.
Had you seen this before?
Yes, I had, although I didn't. Yeah, I mean, it had been about 20 years since I last saw it.
Right.
And I remember thinking it was pretty shit. But yeah, no, it's bonkers. One thing I will say, John mentioned the director, Andrew Morgan. I mean, he's served a shit sandwich. But I think out of everyone involved, apart from possibly the special effects team, who I think are at least trying to do something new.
Some good model work in it.
There is also some good model work. I think the way he directs some of the exteriors is quite good. Like some of the Quarry stuff I think feels quite dynamic, and he uses some weird lenses and filters on people running around to try and get something else kind of going there. I mean, I think no one can direct a studio thing which involves Sylvester McCoy falling down 2 steps in a hilarious way well. And so I will give him a pass on that because I think that's a bad idea and no director could have handled that well. Also, I'm just going to throw out there, whilst I agree that Bonnie Langford is not brilliant, I quite like the character of Mel. I think partly because it's a massive step on from all the other 80s companions who are just horrible and hate being there and hate the Doctor and want to get off. Yeah. She's I think, sparky. Is quite spirited and perky. I quite like... I think I personally find Bonnie Langford quite a likeable presence. She's not a good I mean, she of all people, I mean, like, experienced old hands like Donald Pickering and Wanda Ventham can't do Pip and Jane Baker dialogue, so God knows Bonnie Langford's not going to be able to. And also she's wearing that insane Barbie doll dress. But then that brings you on to Kate O'Mara dressing up as Bonnie Langford for 2 episodes, which again, that's fucking bonkers. I mean, this thing is insane. And so I kind of feel like the fact that it kept chucking stuff at me, I'm not saying it's in
like a chimpanzee.
Yeah. Yes. I'm not saying it in a so bad it's good kind of way, because I think that's kind of a bit of a nonsense sort of critical, so bad it's good stuff generally tends to have an aesthetic that you're latching onto even if you think the rest of it doesn't work. But it's mad. It's absolutely mad. And in some ways then I find that quite refreshing over a lot of the Peter Davison and Colin Baker stuff we've watched, which I've just found dull.
No, I think
that's my
see,
piece.
I don't think it is mad. I think it's just very, very bad.
Is it dangerous to know as well?
Well, I wouldn't want to be seen in public with a copy of this. I didn't watch this on the tube like I often do.
You have to. It's getting really, for me at this point. It's getting even worse. Like, if I think about Trial of a Time Lord, Trial of a Time Lord looks pretty competently put together by comparison to this, I think.
I wouldn't get too carried away.
No, I don't mean... I don't.
This is not competently put together at all. But I just think there's something so combustibly nuts about it. None of it works. But it's almost like this is the proof that if you put a bunch of monkeys in a room typing, they'll come up with something. Because it's like no one is working.
They'll look more convincing than the Lucurtius.
No one is doing anything. No one's listening to each other on this at all.
But this is kind of
combustible, I think.
So the show has already been on hiatus once. It was basically cancelled. It had to be reprieved. It was reprieved. You get Trial of a Time Lord, and as Jim said, it must have been a huge surprise after Trial of a Time Lord that it was given another go. Right?
Yeah,
with a new Doctor.
Done. Yeah.
And John Nathan Turner makes the decision that in order to introduce a new Doctor, he's going to cast a Ken Campbell tribute act as the Doctor, and as the comeback special, he's going to commission
Elvis 68 comeback special.
Pip and Jane Baker to write it. I mean, this isn't a man who cares anymore.
Well, again, the Pip and Jane could turn around
famously.
scripts. Yeah.
He was almost doing it at gunpoint at this point.
Yeah, he was very, very keen to leave at this point. But I think in terms of getting Pip and Jane, they just managed to do the last episode of Trial, whether you think it's any good or not. But they were able to turn around a workable script quite quickly. So you can see why he would have gone to them if he had absolutely nothing else there. But you wonder why he didn't get some stuff for his successor, Eddie. You don't know I've never been a TV producer, but when you see him on interviews, he does always. When you see him in interviews, J&T just sounds like, but I only had a few months and I was going to be on leave for a month. It's like, what? Can you do your bloody job properly, guy?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, it's like, not to get too sort of inside baseball on it, but one of the things that I think is quite often, because a lot of people say, well, why didn't he just leave? And the BBC worked on a staff model at the time. Like, I'm TV producer, I'm freelance. The role of a staff producer just no longer exists. It's all become freelance, and in that way you're only as good as your CV. Now, at that point, TV was in a transitional phase where they were moving to a much more freelance model. But if you were staff at the BBC, salaried employee, you did what you were told to do, and if you didn't want to do it, then you were out of a job. And I think with Doctor Who and Doctor Who, not good Doctor Who, being the only thing on his CV, my understanding is what you wanted to do is stay at the BBC, do a couple of other productions, and then go freelance. Whereas, he would have absolutely sunk on the freelance market if all he had was the arse end of Doctor Who to his name. So I have some sympathy that it's basically, it wasn't just that, I think a lot of people feel he should have taken the principled high ground and stepped away from the show, but essentially he would be just completely sacrificing his living. And that's the thing. I don't think he cares at this point. I don't think he cared enough about Doctor Who to feel it would be worth completely putting himself out of work. And really, he didn't work after Doctor Who was cancelled, after he finally left the BBC. So I sort of have some personal sympathy with him there. But, I mean, what you really do get the sense is that this is a man phoning it in. And it's only really when, at least, Cartmel has some sort of enthusiasm for doing something. And as I say, I don't think any of us have really liked any of the McCoy stuff at all that we've seen. But at least Cartmel, I think, is sort of saying, you could do this, you could do this, you could do this. And he's doing none of these things terribly well, but he's got at least some enthusiasm. Yeah,
I mean, one of the positive JNT story from this, which I think is in Cartmel's biography, if I remember, is that, he's hired by JNT as the script editor. He's given the Time and the Rani script and hates it. And even though JNT's a big defender of Pip and Jane, and he thinks he likes the fact that they can deliver workable scripts quickly, rather than he's not really got much idea about story.
As a producer, that is something that
yes,
I can tell you it's not.
But Cartmel says when he's the new guy there and he's only in his early 20s or something, but he's tearing this to pieces and saying this isn't going to work. JNT sides with his script editor rather than these guys who he has a much longer relationship with, which does sound like, good for you that you're sticking by your choice of script editor there rather than these much more seasoned and presumably guys you have a good sort of personal relationship with as well. But yeah, it is telling that this is nothing like even the next story, Paradise Towers, which feels a lot more like what we come to know the McCoy era as. Just to go back to the positives that you had, what do you what do you make of Kev McCulloch here? I know there's the usual thing to say, but something that's always struck me with this is years ago. A friend actually had a CD of, I don't think it was called The Best of Kev McCulloch, but something like Kev McCulloch's Space Thieves, which he picked up from a garden centre, I think. But one of the pieces on that is called, I think, Future...
That's surely the most interesting part of this story.
One of the pieces on that, I think, is called Future Pleasure, which is this piece they're playing in the Leisure Zone here, which I actually think is quite a good piece of music. It's really... We're usually used to the bombast and the very date-stamped 87 synths that he uses, but that's quite a nice piece.
I mean, the thing
You're
about...
clutching at straws here, Jim.
I know.
I don't know. I've thought a lot about Kev McCulloch. I mean, a little behind the scenes here, guys, that it wasn't Kev McCulloch who did our Christmas caroling when he turned up. Sorry to break it to you. It was, in fact, me. And in order to do that, I had to listen to...
The scales have dropped from
I know, I'm sorry. In order to do that, I listened to a lot of Kev McCulloch in order to pull apart what's actually going on here.
What were your conclusions?
My conclusion was ultimately, I think he thought that... Because he was like... He wasn't really a TV composer guy, was he? He was a session musician and had been in a couple of bands in the 70s and 80s, but he was just sort of freelance gun for hire. Again, I'm going to hold my hands up, shoot me. I like his arrangement of the theme. I think it has a level of production to it which his scores don't, which I think are very much just like, got to crank something out here. He uses all of the stock samples on the EMU emulator synthesizer. You can hear all of the patches, which you can now download freely off the internet, are all over this. The Orc hit sound, the chord sounds at the top.
There are bits that I've definitely heard in Pet Shop Boys records.
I mean, there are samples there that are on all sorts of... there's also, at one point, the famous EMU emulator Shakuhachi sample, which appears on the beginning of Sledgehammer by Peter Gabriel. The one
the sort of flute.
The flute that goes... And that's all over Enigma records, which are made with much the same gear.
And Le Park by Tangerine Dream.
Yes, it is. But again, to me, I mean, the score's awful, and it really... I mean, it cuts against what's going on the screen all the time, and has got some really bad bits in it, like when when the Doctor comes out dressed as the Fifth Doctor and wielding the cricket bat, and then you hear a glass break sound as part of the score or something. It's just like, oh, this is bad. This is bad. But again, the bombast is so insane that when the visuals match it, like I think at the end of Part 1, the cliffhanger for Part 1, I'm not saying that it's good, but I'm saying it just hits this sort of level of mental intensity that I don't know, I wasn't bored by it. I've seen some very boring cliffhangers in the time.
So you sound to have actually found some, I don't know about gold, but some kind of metal in there.
I think there are some technical aspects to this, like, say, the sort of rudimentary attempts for CGI, which was a cutting-edge thing. I mean, it's not that Doctor Who was failing to do what other TV shows were doing much better at the time. I mean, that's hard technology to work with at that point. And I don't know, that just this. It feels like there is an attempt to infuse the show with a bit of a new aesthetic. Like, it feels like a lot of the people involved in the technical delivery of this are thinking of this as a relaunch, even if the script and even if other aspects of it, like the script, the recasting, the dialogue, most of it, to be honest, is not there. But I don't know. I do get the impression that there are some people working quite hard to make something new out of Doctor Who, and occasionally I see something aesthetic in this that makes me go, "Huh, that's interesting."
The design and execution of the Tet Traps, the fact that they look like an Alf gone wrong aside,
with pot bellies,
it is something that looks markedly different from previous Doctor Who monsters.
Yes,
and let's be honest, better. Like it's not the Merker, is it?
Well, no. I mean,
it's
I think
quite a well.
It's a well-made mask.
It's a well-made mask.
The eyes move.
Of which I think you get a few in the Sylvester McCoy era. I mean, I think whoever's doing their latex work is good at this point.
Yeah, and the one with Sheila Hancock.
Oh,
yes, Fifi, Happiness Patrol.
Yeah.
I quite like the I mean, it's not a good episode, obviously, but the Destroyer from Battlefield as well. That's a good mask. Yeah, I mean, and I think these are all new people that are joining the series at the start here. and just, the fact that you can make a quarry look pink, is again a step up from what Doctor Who could do previously.
But even with the tetraps, the trouble there is it's a good mask, but they're not really... Again, there's just nothing much is done with them.
No.
And for all of the money they've spent on that, they seem to have had to cut back on the Lacurtions to the extent that they've just gone, let's make them all look like Pat Sharp.
Yeah. And the sets are really bad as well. I mean, there's actually only two. I like a lot of the quarry stuff because I think it looks quite distinctive. But then
Certainly by comparison with the studio effort.
Yeah, I mean, you just move basically between the Rani's lab and then there's the brief visit to the centre of leisure, and then there's that corridor where they're being shut in where the geniuses are being held in their thing, and that's kind of it, really. I mean, the set stuff's really bad.
I just want to know what Pip and Jane Baker thought they were doing.
They were doing a rollicking adventure.
Yeah, but I don't have anything.
I see what you mean, though.
Nothing.
There is a level of inexplicableness to their scripts, which is just, either you can see that something's lazy. I think they've probably put quite a lot of effort into this.
Oh, it always sounds like they're always very keen to say they had a friend who worked in a physics department or whatever.
Yeah, and they lift stuff up.
Yeah, they lift stuff over there.
And it does spray ideas around. Yeah. It's like Strange Matter. It's dense in the fact that you've got all this, the technical details of the asteroid. All of this stuff is dense. Also,
it sprays them around like a loose catheter, though, doesn't it?
I mean, that's exactly the metaphor I would use.
Their telesnap reconstructions are great.
And that's why I find them so intriguing. There's something that doesn't quite connect there. I think they're quite intelligent and well researched, but there's just a perfect storm of something that is just for them.
Yeah, no, like I say, I think they didn't really know what Doctor Who did. JNT wasn't going to pick them up because I don't think he really understood either.
No.
And this is the point when someone did go, no, this isn't what we're going to be doing with the show. So,
but I mean, like Mark of the Rani, though, the thing that I find intriguing about Pip and Jane Baker is that they almost accidentally alight on something interesting. Like, I remember when we were saying we kind of got into a bit of a what if scenario with Mark of the Rani about rewriting, saying like, well, this industrial setting is interesting. The idea of having
for the Sixth Doctor.
Yeah, it works for the Sixth Doctor, and there's X, Y, and Z you could do, and suddenly we had kind of rearranged all the pieces into something that sounded a little more plausible. Here, what you've got rumbling on in the background, which it seems uninterested in exploring at all, and it's actually far less effective at doing this than, say, the case that John quite persuasively made last month for Destiny of the Daleks. There's this idea of collaboration somewhere in the mix that they've obviously thought about, that Bayus, the Lacurtian, as a collaborator, thinking he's doing the right thing to ensure the ongoing survival of his people, and the idea that his people are indolent. There's clearly a point that they're trying to make in the trip to the centre of leisure, that these guys are almost kind of content to be occupied and happy with their lot, versus what Icona is sort of bringing to the table of saying, no, you actually have to overthrow this menace, rather than just them being kind of blitzed out and letting the collaboration happen around them.
While they listen to Kev McCulloch.
Yeah, while they listen to Kev McCulloch. And so that's almost interesting. And you feel like, had someone looked at the script and said, oh no, that's almost a society you've built there. If you were to build that out a bit more, there might be an interesting story worth telling. And then it seems to miss any of the fact that the Rani is sort of a eugenicist, essentially, who's interested in applying this through technological means, whilst also undergoing the occupation of another country. There's a whole, you could have done a Terry Nation and do a really good Nazi analogy here, but it's almost like Pip and Jane Baker have written this stuff and then missed the fact that that's all there.
I would go as far as to say that everyone here has brought their A game. It's just that no one's good enough.
Yeah.
I don't doubt that they have actually gone to a lot of effort. I'm not suggesting they dashed it off in an afternoon. I mean, last month, I should be very clear about this. Last month, I wasn't saying that Destiny and the Daleks was great. I was just saying it was a fascinating mess, that it was kind of... There were almost like two teams of people working on it. Terry Nation, Douglas Adams. There are two sets of ideas which don't really come together and so on.
Whereas here there's a million sets of ideas. Everyone's doing something different. McCoy's doing something different. The director's doing something different. The writers, the designers, the musician. It's almost like everyone is working in isolation to do their stuff.
And ultimately, who's responsible for that?
The producer.
Right.
Yeah, of course. No, I'd be fired if I turned into something like this. But I mean, that I think gets to the nub of what I find so interesting about this, that it's almost like everyone is working completely in isolation, and it's only in the final edit they brought everything together, and it was like, oh fuck, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
And also, it's not good.
No,
like Pip and Jane Baker going 100 miles an hour. This is their best work. They've spent 3 months on it or whatever. It's still not good.
No,
but I'm not blaming them. I'm not saying that they haven't put effort. They get marks for effort, fine, but that doesn't change what's landed on the screen.
So, Jim, question I have for you. You mentioned a while ago that you were starting to...
warm to the McCoy era.
Yeah, warm to the McCoy era. I mean, I sort of have a bit of a theory that a lot of the hatred that was directed at the McCoy era was sort of born out of the idea that that was the thing that killed Doctor Who. And now that Doctor Who's not dead and has been back for ages and has been now an international success, and I think looks to be a fixture for a long time to come, that's mellowed somewhat, that kind of hatred of it.
I think also there's the fact that at the time, I'm not even sure if there was that much hatred of it at the time, because I just wasn't paying attention. You know, I wasn't buying Doctor Who Monthly or magazine, whatever it was called at the time. I was reading Starburst, and you get the odd comment in there, but Doctor Who was kind of forgotten really at that point. People were more interested in things like Star Trek Next Generation, all the big sci-fi fantasy films that come out, Aliens and John Carpenter stuff and whatnot. So I wasn't aware... This
is the year that Star Trek Next Generation started, isn't it?
So I wasn't really aware of what fan opinion was. In fact, I was surprised a few years later...
Though no one in the UK would have seen it yet.
No.
Actually...
Might have been on Sky or something. Early form of Sky or something.
I think a little while later I was surprised when I bumped into an old school friend, and we'd both been hugely into Doctor Who and hadn't seen each other for years. And when he was still into it and I drifted off. And I was surprised when it turned out that the fans liked McCoy. I was kind of surprised to hear that.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know what the fan consensus was. For me, in terms of warming to it, which I think I said at the time, because I think it was when we did Happiness Patrol and the Time Monster on the same podcast.
Yeah.
Watching those two back to back, rather than just looking at the McCoy and thinking this is such cheap rubbish, and then you look at the Time Monster and think, well, actually, there's a precedent for Doctor.
Yes.
I still prefer the Time Monster, but yeah, you could see there's, it didn't alter maybe quite as much as I was expecting. It was maybe sort of washing away some of the nostalgic glow that's attached to the 70s. So yeah, I mean, I find the McCoy era. We've said it many times. I still think his acting is terrible. I find some of the attempts at doing social and political things a little too on the nose. But I'd rather have that than the Saywood era, which was just a guy trying to make mercenary stories and no concern for the Doctor at all. So I'd prefer at least Cartmel had a vision and was trying to do something with it. And it seems like, going back to what you were saying earlier, JNT at that point seemed to just step back and be happy to be the guy who did the logistics and made sure something got on screen, rather than, we must cast this person,
Do you not feel that there's... I mean, this is a large amount of separation is put between this and the rest of the McCoy era, because, this isn't anything to do with Andrew Cartmel. He really kicks off with the following story. I do find that the McCoy era, and I keep coming back to the aesthetic of this, the McCoy era does have quite a distinct aesthetic feel to it compared to the rest of 80s Doctor Who. And to me, like a lot of the I do feel like a lot of the design elements do feel of a piece with a lot of stuff that comes later, say the better quality latex masks, the slightly sort of use of garish and sort of surrealistic colours on this kind of thing. I feel it's mainly the script that's doing something different, but I don't feel that this is so divorced from the rest of the McCoy era.
Possibly not. I mean, this particular story...
Yes, Time in the Rani.
Yeah, no, aesthetically it feels pretty similar, certainly. It is... I think it really is just... The thing I'm always thinking of with the McCoy era is the starting point is usually someone wanting to say something, and as John has pointed out, this is just an adventure, not a very exciting one. It's just, the mad scientist and the crazy aliens. There's nothing here to... All right, the points you picked up about the Bayus as the Quisling, who's sort of concerned about his people's indolence.
It's entirely accidental and is not interesting here.
That's nothing like Paradise Towers, which we've not reviewed, and we'll come on to that in the fullness of time. But even that feels much like a statement of intent. None of us feel this is a good introduction to the Seventh Doctor.
No.
I think it's an ideal introduction to the Seventh Doctor.
I mean, would you have preferred it if it had gone straight in with not necessarily Paradise Towers, but one of those more typical McCoy, or are you not?
I think they should have just
way?
called it a day, and I'm not even kidding. Sorry.
What, you'd have rather just wiped out the show after Trial of the Time Lord?
Yeah.
Leave it on a high.
Yeah. No, but I mean, look, there's a couple of stories. I appreciate the fact that Cartmel tries to do something, but ultimately the McCoy era is missed opportunities, probably because of you say that it's a good thing that the producer wants to sit back because it means at least some ideas are sort of getting to screen. I don't disagree, but a producer sitting back with a 20-something script editor is not the ideal combination for any of those ideas to actually work and make the screen. So the fact that John Nathan Turner is so detached, seemingly, not connecting up the dots between the design work and the scripts and the direction and the casting and making sure that it is a seamless kind of whole, even if everybody's doing their bit, that it's a whole, with a script editor who's perhaps ambitious, but that can't work, and it doesn't work. And although I applaud some of the ambition, it hasn't really landed for me in any one of the McCoy stories that we've looked at. So I think it would have been perhaps better for them to have cut their losses, yeah. But I understand why, look, it's there now, so there's no point. There's no point in re-legislating.
We are gonna watch all of it.
Yeah, there's no point re-legislating all of that, what have you. But yeah, I mean, I find it very difficult to disagree with. Well, no, let me put it this way. I find it difficult to disagree with Grade and that lot in the mid-80s that this was a bad television programme that was being produced. Where I differ is that I think that with the right team and resources, they probably could have made something better. The fact that they decided not to do that, I find it perplexing that they would continue down the road of making it.
Sylvester McCoy as the new Doctor Who personality predictably provoked a large response from you, but I'm afraid the Doctor Who Appreciation Society are not pleased. Mr. Gorman, a society spokesman, rang to say he thought the new Doctor, quote, is the worst thing John Nathan Turner, Doctor Who's producer, had ever done. The programme, he says, needed a massive lift that a well-known actor would have brought. This decision is the death knell of Doctor Who. Well, that's pretty gloomy, but there is indeed some optimism from Brian Mason from Troon, who wished the Doctor Who, the new Doctor Who, the very best of luck, and indeed, so say all of us.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, that just about wraps it up for March's show. John, do we have any feedback? Do you want to delve into your bulging sack?
I've got into the postbag.
Into the postbag.
Yeah, we've got we've had a few tweets.
Lovely.
This month. So first off, we've got Christopher Bryant, chap_with_wings.
Brilliant. Always love hearing that name.
He's written in another terrific Explain Later pod this month. The first two sections are good, but it kicks into high gear with a story on which all three hosts have differing opinions. He, of course, means Destiny of the Daleks. For the record, I agree with arse and balls, which I believe was Matt's take.
Yes.
Those are two of our opinions.
Yeah.
Or maybe Chris's nickname for two of the reviewers. Yeah. That comedy act from the 80s.
Yes,
yeah.
Keith Arse and Johnny Johnny Balls was a person. Sorry, no, ignore that. Yes, I was thinking when I was editing back that no one has ever compared Destiny of Daleks to Triumph of the Will, but John West did, ladies and gentlemen.
And we had
That's
a lovely...
why we're a 5-star rated podcast on iTunes.
And we had what I thought was a lovely tweet from Crinoid Podcast, who said, I'm on episode 9 now. Wasn't sure about the first couple, but it really picks up. The serial format makes it really compelling viewing, and the leads are excellent, in my opinion. But then I realised he was replying to a tweet I'd done about Star Trek Discovery.
Oh.
So actually nothing to do with us at all. But yeah, still, thanks very much for the feedback.
You're
Crinoid.
dressed as Doug Jones while we do the podcast, though, aren't you? The sort of tin salmon man from Star Trek Discovery.
We've got a lovely tweet back from David Kitchen on the Doctor Who show, who thanks us for the shout out to them last month, and he adds that he agrees with all of us on Destiny of the Daleks, depending on his mood.
Oh,
so he probably needs to get down to his psychiatrist.
While we're on the subject of David Kitchen, I think he's about to start, or maybe has by the time this cast goes out, doing a Blake Seven podcast called
That's right.
Fall. Yeah.
What's it called?
Spacefall, which is
Spacefall.
one of the first episodes. So I'm looking forward to hearing that.
Yeah, I mean they do a lot of output on the Doctor Who show feed, and our lazy once a month effort. Yeah, if you need a more of a fix, then those guys are doing some great work. So big shout out to them again.
If you think the I'll Explain Later guys are lazy bastards, then write to us.
No, write to them.
Yeah, write to them.
Similarly, the New to Who podcast guys, hello. They very kindly wrote in to say that it was another superb episode from us, and they strongly encourage their sweet dorks to listen to us.
Oh.
So thank you very much
Cheers.
indeed. Just finally, we've got the On the Time Lash podcast, long-term...
Back.
Long-term friends of ours.
Yeah, they're back after a long absence.
They are. They're just doing their Series 6.
Abstinence.
And they said that
Hope not.
they said they've been catching up on both I'll Explain Later and New to Who podcast. Good grief, the military-industrial complex, fascist figureheads, castration allegories, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, we'll have to up our game when we start recording. And I said... was your immediate thought unsubscribe? But they very kindly said that they were very happy with the output. So I thank them for saying that, even if it's not true.
Oh, it's nice of them. Well, if you want to get in touch with us, you can do so. Email hello@I'llExplainLater.com. You can tweet us at ExplainLaterPod on Twitter. Facebook.com/I'llExplainLater if you're Facebook-minded. And I say this every month, but please leave us a nice review on Apple Podcasts. I've had some very nice feedback on there, so thanks to everyone who's left some thoughts. But
I think Pip and Jane Baker have left a review for us.
Oh, yeah, looking forward to that. Yeah,
they let us a package downstairs as well.
And Karen Clegg, she's...
Just forming that orderly queue behind Eric Sayward and Mark Gatiss and the woman from Dragonfire.
We can't even be bothered to remember her name.
One of those people will kill us.
Yes.
Find
out
on Doctor Who's shit list.
next time.
We'll be back in April. Enjoy the rest of your March. We'll see you then.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Hold it down, boy. Your head's getting blurred. I know you can't stop thinking of her. By all means, you can vibe with this girl, but just don't rug yourself. That's all. Don't rug yourself.
So The Doctor's Wife's the greatest episode, I think, of Moffat's tenure.
Fine. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't need to turn up next week now. We can just splice that in.
Don't. That's, oh man. That's...
Are you recording? Have you got that?
Yeah, I've got that.
Yeah, keep that for a special occasion.